Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Well, lots been going on in Ottawa, even though it's the quiet summer period, which is amazing. And I thought we'd check in with Dan Donovan, the publisher and editor of Ottawa Life magazine again, and find out what he thinks about some of the goings on. And so I think we're going to talk about C18, this online media bill that's made its way through Parliament. Talk a little bit about Pierre Poilievre and his repositioning without glasses. Both of us are wearing glasses. I'm not sure why you look far better without glasses on, but some people think you do. And maybe about where Trudeau is in the polls, because it's pretty dismal right now, at least for the Liberal Party it is. Dan Donovan, welcome to the show, sir.
Well, thanks for having me on again, Brian. I always enjoy our discussions, and it's certainly been an eventful summer here in the capital, even though the Hill and the MPs are. The Hill isn't, actively political right now because all the MPs are at home in their constituencies. The work of government still goes on, apparently.
Apparently it does. C18, you called it pretty negative things. Tell me about what you think of C18, Bill C18.
Well, we published an article on the website last week on this. This is Bill C18 is the Liberal government's new online news act. And we published an article last week in Ottawa Life that was titled "Canada's Greedy and Needy Mainstream Media Cannibalize Themselves," because this is probably the most heavy-handed legislation and attack on free media in this country in our history. And what's really outrageous about it is that the government just bullied its way through Parliament with Mr. Trudeau and Mr. Singh. They ignored all the experts, including a foremost expert, Michael Geist, who's renowned in this area of law and who appeared before the committee. And I would people just Google him and just see his submission to Parliament. It's an ideologically based bill. And basically what it showcases is, and I'm not as you know, Brian, we deal in sort of real facts here. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I will say this. We wrote an article 5 years ago, to this day remains the largest read article ever on our website. It was called The Deep State. And it was about lobbyists in Ottawa and how lobbyists in this country are running the country. And if you'll just bear with me for a moment, because I'm going to swing this back to this media bill.
Oh my God, the deep states in Canada as well as the United States.
Well, I think it's a little different up here, and we was a bit of a pun up here because the deep state here are the lobbyists, the paid lobbyists that control government here and control the cabinet and certainly have their hands into and deep control over this government. We wrote that article back in 2018 after during the SNC-Lavalin scandal, and we broke down in some detail all of the meetings, over 90 meetings between lobbyists and the PMO's office and the Treasury Board, President Scott Bryson at the time, how lobbyists coerced Parliament into changing the criminal code in an omnibus financial bill without even appearing before the Justice Committee. That incident came up in a committee meeting, coincidentally at the time, by Pierre Poilievre, who was a shadow finance critic, and at like 1 a.m. is saying, what is this section on page, so-and-so of this massive bill where you're changing the criminal code? And that was the attempt at the time to get SNC off, to allow them to have broken the law and get away with it. It got caught, and then, of course, the whole SNC thing exploded in the government's face. Now, with regards to Bill C18, the Liberal government's new Online News Act, here's what's happened. We've had a lot of changes, as you know, in the last decade, from the transition from print media to digital media. It's impacted television, social media, online media. The internet has impacted television, print, newspaper, everything. So those are entrepreneurial ventures, or they used to be. Media. There's the hundreds of platforms across this country. You're one of them that talk about public and current affairs and so forth. The legacy media in this country, meaning Bell, Rogers, Telus, CTV, BCE, Bell, Bell owns the Globe and Mail, they own CTV and others, right? They lobbied the government big time, using lobbyists in 2017 and 2018 for billions of dollars in welfare because they were having trouble. The print newspapers are having trouble keeping their subscribers and readers. As we know, Torstar is in big trouble right now. The Toronto Star. Post Media is owned by a hedge fund out of New York. They're 1.2 or 1.3 billion dollars in debt. They're paying 114 million in interest on the debt a year. So these lobbyists went to work for these large legacy Canadian media corporations and went to the government hand out saying, you need to help us, we're going to lay off all these journalists, you need to give us multi-millions of dollars to support us, and we'll put that money into the newsrooms and it'll be better for news. And of course, the Liberal government, because they took a stupid pill, they listened to all of this stuff, and they literally, between 2018 and last year, gave between Bell Media, Rogers, Torstar, St. Joseph Media, and the CBC is a whole other thing. That's a whole other canard, French word there. Your listeners probably know that. It's another canard, okay? But they gave these companies billions of dollars in handouts, in grants. And for mid-sized and smaller platforms, of which we're like a mid-size, and there's smaller ones as well, we got nothing. Or 90% of the funding went to these big corporate, I call them greed pigs. They took everything. It didn't do anything for journalism in the country. And guess what happened? They still did cuts. They still laid off people. If you don't believe me, just look at the cuts 6 weeks ago at CTV. They laid off 1,300 people, including some of their most high-profile international correspondents. In the meantime, parallel to this, you've got the Trudeau government giving the state broadcaster, the CBC, $1.4 billion a year in funding. And the CBC, of course, does advocacy news. And what that means is they report the news of the government that the government wants them to do for the most part. I mean, there's a few differences, and I'm not talking, there's some good things on CBC radio, but generally the CBC has lost all news credibility, especially with the press gallery and people in Ottawa. They have become a mouthpiece for the government. So between giving the CBC all of this taxpayer money and then giving these other mainstream, these legacy corporations billions of dollars, they said, this will help pull us out of this spiraling decline into the abyss of a black hole of nothing that they were facing, because they Toronto Star mismanaged their business. They didn't do the print to digital transition properly like La Presse did in Montreal. And the Toronto Star, which used to make hundreds of millions of dollars in a quarter, was sold like a couple of years ago for $73 million, and the initial families that controlled it were forced out. So, and the same for Post Media. So Post Media, they sold their soul. They're owned by American hedge funds. So this first round of billions and billions and billions of taxpayers' dollars didn't work. So what did they do next? They said, they got their lobbyists to work again, and then they started attacking Google and Facebook under the guise that they're going to fight. It's David versus Goliath, and the government trying to present themselves as David. And I think they more importantly just, were jokers. It's a joke. They're trying to position themselves on this, that they're gonna defend media. But in fact, what they're doing is they're attacking the very platform that all of the other media in the country, including us, including you, and including hundreds of publications across the country, well, these guys are sucking wind and mismanaging their businesses, other smaller, mid-sized businesses, and by the way, leaving the local market. CBC left the local markets. CTV right now is trying to get out of local news programming, and they went to the CRTC asking to be pulled out of local news programming. So while they're failing, what happened? A lot of entrepreneurial and other businesses, and businesses like us who've been around for a couple of decades, we just kept working our business. And we have this platform, this highway called Facebook and Google and Instagram. And we put out good content, great content, and people came to us and watched us. And we generated revenue from that through paid links and ads and other things. Now, the big platforms, they're failing. So they're saying, well, wait a second. they should be paying us for if we're going to carry our news on there, because everybody's going on there, so we have to be on there, but they should pay us if we go on their platform. They should pay us. Well, you know what? Don't go on their platform if you want to be paid, because that's not what their model is. So what they did is instead of competing, they went back cap in hand to the government, and they said, here's what we want you to do. We know you've just given us billions of dollars, which you've just wasted, and we've laid off thousands more journalists, okay, and we've done nothing to stop the hemorrhaging. What we want you to do now is to penalize all the mid-sized companies and the little companies that are using the information highway of Facebook and Google to reach their customers. We want you to shut that down so we can force people back onto our platforms. And guess what the Trudeau government did? They went along with it. They went along with it. So that's why your viewers will be hearing ads on the radio now. Hey, you know, because of Facebook not allowing CTV material to be carried on their platform, download our app and come right on our site. So it's coercion. They're trying to force people back onto their sites. It's anti-democratic. It's anti-media. It's going to fail in the end. The government is failing at this because they figured that Facebook and Google would negotiate, but they're not going to negotiate. So they've just started blocking. We're one of them. They blocked some of our content. We're appealing that. But you know, once there's a change in government, this should change. But if you go back and listen to just about anyone who had a brain that appeared before that House of Commons committee, every single person was saying this is a bad idea, except for the big legacy media whores who took all the money. They're the only ones who wanted this law, and that's what we call the deep state, the profound influence of lobbyists in this government.
We're going to take a break for some messages and come back. And I'm going to ask Dan, you know, is there a different side to the story? And is there any justification for the newspapers, the news media to be paid? What happened in Australia when this was tried before? You know, some of the attacks against Facebook and Google and people like that to pay their fair share of taxes, which is another issue that's in front of the government. Stay with us, everyone. This is going to be an interesting topic tonight. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Dan Donovan. He is the editor and publisher of Ottawa Life magazine. He is of the opinion that C18, this bill that has been recently passed by the federal government, digital media bill, is a huge mistake. And it is there because of lobbying from the major news media companies, the legacy media companies, the way he calls them. Dan, this was tried in Australia as well, was it not? And failed fairly quickly.
Well, in Australia, it didn't work, and the journalists weren't compensated. And I think it's pretty accepted over there that it didn't work. And the law in Canada that they tried to put in was actually even more extreme in trying to force the hand of big media here. And again,
force the hand of big media or force the hand of Google and Facebook?
Well, I guess it depends on, you know, what side of it you look at. I mean, again, an expert said this in committee in Ottawa many times over. Google and Facebook are platforms. They are service providers. They're the internet highway. And the government and no one, let's be really clear about this, no one in Canada outside of the failing legacy media were asking for Google and Facebook to pay them money. We weren't asking for it. I know hundreds of businesses and people in media who said this is insane. We appreciate the fact that we can compete and carry our information on the information highway. Okay, but they shut down the highway and they're putting a toll on it. And no one asked for the toll except for the failing media companies who have already gotten billions of dollars in subsidies and who are continue to fail.
Okay,
and by the way,
but you know, let's take it just for a second from their point of view. So Facebook and Google are making a lot of money in ad revenue from people that are today getting the vast majority of their news not through reading a newspaper, not through going to a newspaper website, but through reading a story here and a story there on Facebook and Google when they see a headline that they find interesting, or frankly, if some friend posts or reposts a headline about some story that they find interesting, makes a comment on them. And so they're making money on the backs of the editorial content, the news content from the major news companies. So don't they deserve some compensation for that?
No, because respectfully, I think that's the wrong analysis. They're not making money off the backs of anyone. They built a system, and they've allowed people to come on their platform and said you can post what you want, and if you post it and people read it, you can make money from it. We make our revenue from posting good material, and people read it, and then that gives us opportunities to do what they call content marketing. Some of it is paid. That allows us to do links within articles, and some of it's paid. So, and that allows us to pay for writers and others to do more. So, they built this highway, and they said, come on it, and there's an opportunity for businesses to make money when they're on the highway. The fact is that the larger media companies have not been able. They've been so greedy. They want, and they've had this control. They've had great control for decades over media in the country, and all of the money that comes with that. The changing dynamics of media and the internet and social media have dramatically impacted them. So what they're trying to do now is hold on to what they had instead of moving forward, like La Presse did in Montreal and navigated its way very great, didn't lose, kept the vast majority of the subscribers. But Tourist Star, the Globe and Mail, not so, the Globe and Mail is a bit of a different bird here, but certainly the post media papers have not had that success. So they're trying to force these companies. We live in a free society. Those companies are businesses, and they have the right to manage their businesses as they wish without having a gun held to their head by a government with an intrusive legislation that basically says to them, forces them, unless you pay us money, we're going to ban your content. So they're saying, okay, they're calling the government's bluff. Ban the content. We'll ban the content. We won't let you on our highway. You're going to try to tell us how to do this? Well, you can't come on our highway. Then you don't get to come on the infrastructure we built if you're going to try to force us to pay you money. And the bluff isn't working. Google and Facebook aren't playing ball here. They're saying, no, this is a real overreach. And again, there's been a ton of expert opinion from lawyers and telecom experts who have come forward and said, this is really, really bad legislation. And the government just ignored everybody.
So I think that those newspapers do deserve to get paid. I question who should be paying them, though. And if I go on my social media, whether it be Facebook or Instagram or LinkedIn, I get someone giving me an article headline every day, if not several times a day, that I'm interested in reading. And that when I click on it, I have to go to a paywall that says, if you want to read the rest of the story, pay up. And so the Globe and Mail, Toronto Star, Financial Post, Washington Post, New York Times, they have a vehicle to get paid. And that is they can put their headline on the social media, but if you want to read the whole article, you have to pay to get into get past the paywall to read the article. And that's a choice they can make. And frankly, it upsets me every time I see that. So I end up just reading the article, just reading the headline of the article and not reading the whole article. But that's their choice, and that should be a choice that they make. And that is a way of them getting paid. So isn't that the right solution, is allowing those, and they do it, having those news media companies to have a paywall?
Well, news media companies are free to have a paywall if they like.
Exactly.
We choose not to do it because, like you just said, what you just said is perfect, because it represents. I would make the claim, for sure, 90% of the people, they don't want to pay for a paywall. They won't. They'll read part of the article and move on, because it's the internet. There's so much material on there. The vast majority of people won't pay. We personally believe our business model here, for example, is that paywalls don't work. So now, I think there's been a case made that it's worked somewhat for the New York Times, it's worked somewhat for the Wall Street Journal. I don't know that it's working for the Globe and Mail. I don't have information on that. Maybe it is. I'm just not aware of it. But what I will say is this: When we looked at it, we said that's not the pathway for us, but we found other pathways to make money on the platform that work, that are beneficial. But these companies, these bigger media companies like CTV and Bell BCE, CTV, Post Media, they are sucking wind. They're in big debt. Post Media's got $114 million interest bill to pay this year, and they're grasping to make money. It's like oxygen. They're lacking oxygen, just grasping to make money, and they decided to spend their money on lobbyists to try and get the government to try to take in this draconian bill.
But it's only going to work. It's only going to work if Facebook and Google give in, because if they don't give in, they're going to be worse off because they're not even going to have their headlines being posted on social media.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more, Brian, and that's why our article was called "Canada's Greedy and Needy Mainstream Media Cannibalize Themselves," because they're so obtuse, they don't even seem to get that by doing this is like shooting themselves in the head, because it's just going to draw people further away from them, unless they think that millions of Canadians are going to all of a sudden start downloading a CTV app and a Post Media app and getting all their news every day from them, which is not what the data is showing that people are doing, especially younger people. Younger people are still going, it's ironic that Americans can get we've been banned on some stuff because of this bill. Some of our sort of what they consider news reporting, you can't get in Canada now on the Facebook platform, but you can get it in the States. I mean, it's absurd, but it just goes to show that this has not been well thought through. Now, the Conservatives have come out and said that they will rescind this bill if they're elected. And I believe that's going to happen. It's going to have to happen anyways, just because we're going to see in about a year, maybe, hopefully it won't take that long, but within, I would say, 8 to 10 months, the legacy media in this country are going to see that this isn't working, and it's actually doing further damage to them.
Well, didn't the Australian situation last only a few weeks?
Yeah, but it didn't work in Australia.
I know, so they rescinded it even more quickly.
Well, it's hard to say here how it's going to play out here, but you would think that when they saw what happened in Australia, they wouldn't proceed. But of course, you can't fix stupid. And again, I go back to the real problem here is the problem with the influence of lobbyists here, and that they were able to, despite all the expert testimony, it was like we had a bunch of sheep MPs, they just put blinders on, they checked their brain at the door, and they voted for this bill. And it's really quite disgraceful, but this is what we've come to see. This is a government that's just being run out of one office, the PMO. This is what the lobbyists wanted. This is what they did, and this is what we get.
I think the bigger issue is that, we've got a problem with lack of news knowledge, civic awareness now. It's only going to get worse, particularly with people that don't even know what a newspaper, actual, printed on print looks like, because they've never opened one to read one. And that's frankly a lot of young people. They've never read a real newspaper. They don't want to read a real newspaper. And they're not going to get the news. They're not going to know what's going on.
Look, I couldn't agree with you more. I find this very distressing that we're at a time now where news in our country, it doesn't seem to be important to, and the importance of news and being informed is not something that is taking hold or being taught in universities, or the importance of this, for young people. And I think, another problem that we're facing is that when you don't have access to the news, you don't have access to, what's going on in government and then the policies in the country and how people are working or not working together in their country. There's a whole lot of real negative fallout from this. And this is something that I lay squarely at the feet of the government and the people behind the scenes who are manipulating this. And I don't see why they're doing it. I don't understand the thinking behind it. It seems to be, a deliberate attempt to just keep people stupid. I don't know, or allow the mainstream media to have one last gasp at trying to get people, younger people, to watch them who are not interested in watching them, who haven't grown up in the last, certainly the younger generation coming out of doing the school to work transition or going from high school into university. They haven't grown up watching these mainstream media outlets or reading newspapers. So where are they getting their news?
I had a conversation with a 17-year-old teenage female a little while ago about women's reproductive rights in Poland and some of the issues associated with what the government in Poland was trying to do in regards to reproductive rights. And she was unbelievably well informed about the issue that I had just a glancing knowledge of based on maybe one or two stories that I had read. I asked her where she got her news from. TikTok. She was unbelievably well informed based on videos and things that she had seen on TikTok. They're getting their news today if they want it, and they're consuming it the way that they consume everything else, and they're consuming it through Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, etc. And I think that's what we should want. We should want well-informed people in our society.
Well, you know what, to your point, I agree. And in fact, I should step back on one thing I just said. I don't want to leave the impression, and I didn't mean to leave the impression that the young people today aren't informed. I think what I was trying to articulate was that young people today are not being informed by traditional newspapers or traditional media or legacy media. What they're doing, and there's so many bright young people, what they're doing is they're finding, to your point, they're finding their news elsewhere. They're finding it online. There's tons of great stuff on TikTok every day. There's news you can find on TikTok, analysis you can find on TikTok, the same on other social media platforms. I just want to point out something that's highly ironic to me. After we've given all of instead of allowing these companies like TikTok and others in Canada and smaller companies to flourish and to present new ideas for getting local news and other news out, what we've done is we have something in Canada called the CRTC, right? That regulates telecoms and media in this country and the way that news is delivered, et cetera. So the CRTC, after BCE Bell Media, which owns CTV, cut 1,300 people, including some of their most senior people, 6 weeks ago, they have an application before the CRTC right now that they're saying they want, because under the CRTC rules, CTV is required right now to provide local news programming so we can get local news out to people. They have formally requested that the CRTC rescind that requirement. And it appears like the CRTC is going to do that. So what that's going to mean as soon as it happens, within months, CTV will shut down all its local newsrooms, local news in Toronto and Ottawa and Red Deer, wherever, because they don't want to pay for it, even though they have like a monopoly here. So all that sideshow is going on. But in the meantime, life goes on. So people like you just mentioned, this young person, they go on TikTok and they find out what's going on. If they hear something about something happening out west with, for example, in the last election, they may, you might hear stuff on the mainstream media here on CBC or CTV about the election. But you know what they do? They go to the source and they find little digital platforms and news writers and others out in Alberta who are right at the source, and they listen to them. That's the new reality here that's happening. And that just further shows you that a government, you have to question, why is a government trying to shut all of that down? Why? That's a serious issue in this country we have to be concerned about. Why would a federal government be trying to shut down our ability to share information, to get news, to get information from different sources? Why is it that they've constructed a bill to try to force Canadians onto certain platforms? And by the way, coincidentally, and again, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, it's coincidental, but they're trying to force them onto platforms who they gave billions of dollars to in the last couple of years, billions of dollars to. And now they're trying to force Canadians to get their news from those platforms. So it's very troubling to me, and it's very disturbing. But you know what? It's not going to work, because you cannot control people's their internet, their access to their internet, their access to social media, their access to information. You cannot control that.
Well, digitization has changed radically almost every other industry. So why wouldn't it change newspapers? What we're trying to do is we're trying to hold up digitization and technological advancement in news media, which is not going to ever happen. Anyway, we're going to take a break for some messages and come back in just 2 minutes with Dan Donovan, and maybe ask him a little bit about another topic that he raised with me. He said there was a hatchet piece on Pierre Poilievre recently. I want to ask him about that, and maybe about polls right now for the Liberal government versus the Conservative opposition. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I'm chatting tonight with Dan Donovan. He's the editor and publisher of Ottawa Life magazine. He's a long experienced individual in Ottawa, used to work on Parliament Hill, has been involved in politics and government and media. He actually, at one point in time, was a stand-up comic, if you can believe it, and was very successful in that regard. Had the opportunity I had the opportunity once for him to take me to Yuck Yucks and show me a show, which was quite a lot of fun. Dan, you said that there was a hatchet piece done on Pierre Poilievre. A hatchet piece, really?
Well, look. Every day we make choices. Our company, our media outlet here, Ottawa Life magazine, that's www.ottawalife.com. We make choices every day about content, and we have a discussion. We have a team here. We go through, what are we doing in this area, in this area, in this area? What are we going to post? What are we not going to post? What are we going to assign? What are we not going to assign? And not a day goes by where we'll get a story request, or we'll get something written, or we'll say, you know what? No, we're not running with that. That's not, and here's why. Here are the reasons why we're not publishing that. You don't have the right information. You haven't done the fact checking. You're making a whole host of assumptions here. It just really depends on whether it's a hard news piece or if it's something that's can be an opinionated piece. It can be a whole host of things. But what the CTV did this weekend, to me, I found it, to be really honest, I found it quite shocking. There was a writer named Mickey Jurek, who's a Canadian press person, and he wrote a piece about Pierre Poilievre has been traveling across Canada this summer, the official leader of the opposition, the Conservative leader. He's been traveling across the country, going to a lot of small towns and communities and cities. And he's been getting huge crowds, thousands of people coming out listening to him. A lot of his message is about the deficit in this country. It's about inflation. It's about wasteful spending. I mean, they're the official opposition, but he's really seemed to have hit a nerve. And some of he talks about the drug and fentanyl crisis in the cities, the increases in crime since the Trudeau government got in, the housing price calamity in this country. So on the week, and he's talked about the World Economic Forum, which, Chrystia Freeland and the Liberal government have been big fans of going to this World Economic Forum. There's this guy, Klaus Schwab, that runs it, and it's a very sort of ideological platform in place where all of a big number of the what political people call the leftist ideology of the Western world comes out, and whether it's the climate change stuff or a whole bunch of stuff. But CTV ran this piece. This is a mainstream newscast, and they ran a piece suggesting that Mr. Poilievre has embraced the language of conspiracy and is sharing conspiracy theories when he is out campaigning and speaking to people, and suggesting that they said he has ramped up rhetoric about the World Economic Forum, that it's attempting to impose its sovereignty on sovereign government. Well, if you look at what Poilievre has said about the World Economic Forum, that's not what he said. What he said is he's questioned, why Western governments have become so obsessed with the World Economic Forum and some of their policies, which don't align with a lot of the traditions and history in our country. And why are we tripping over ourselves to run with some of the ideological policies that are coming out of this forum? It's a very legitimate issue to raise in the environment today. But the way they couched it in this article was that he's a conspiracy theorist. And, I read that and I thought, well, why would they be running that as a mainstream story on their broadcast and pushing that? I was trying to look around to see, well, are they running any stories about the crowds he's getting out, about people's reaction in Atlantic Canada, where the Liberal support is collapsing because of the carbon tax, and Poilievre is down there speaking about that? They don't seem to write about that stuff, but they seem to go for this knee-jerk reaction, sugary stuff where, oh, he's a conspiracy theorist. And my point is this: I just think that the mainstream media in this country, all media, in fact, have a responsibility to be careful when it comes to how they're reporting about the leader of the official opposition of the country. They may not like Mr. Poilievre personally, and frankly, there's a lot of people in the parliamentary press gallery here that seem to have a burr on their side about Mr. Poilievre. But the fact is, he was elected by 500,000 people in a Conservative Party leadership last year, and he has the second largest amount of seats in the Parliament, and he's the official leader of the opposition. So with that goes a certain responsibility when the press are reporting to try to be accurate, or to try to, if they're going to say something like this, they have to put it in a better context, rather than this sort of throwing schlock against the wall to suggest this guy's a conspiracy theorist. And I just think it's really irresponsible.
You also objected to, some of the positioning that the media took about Poilievre and the trucker convoy and vaccine mandates and things like that. And he did, it would appear, lean towards some of those issues. But you're saying that the media suggested he was really supportive of those issues rather than just leaning toward them. Is that your point?
Well, I think it goes back to, again, context, right? Remember, when Mr. Poilievre was during the trucker protest, and Brian, you and I, as I recall, we did an interview back then when in the middle of the whole trucker protest, and we were as upset as the next person in Ottawa. We wrote articles saying, listen, enough with this thing. You've made your point, go home. You don't have the right to come in and shut down a city. Now, it's the middle of COVID, but the other part of it is, what people do have the right to is to protest. People in this country have the right to protest. And in COVID, the truckers here, as we've talked about before, the whole trucker incident was a police failure. They allowed the police in this city, put on, just had a complete breakdown and allowed hundreds of these trucks to just take over our city. It was a complete police breakdown. Having said that, tens of thousands of protesters who came over the next couple of weeks, a lot of them were just regular Canadians tired of COVID and tired of being told, we're having another shutdown, you need to do this, you need to do that. I'm a supporter of vaccines. I got my vaccines, but the other reality is, and these are things Poilievre was saying at the time, people have the right to protest. People have the right to put something in their body, and if they don't want to put it in their body, they have the right to say no. That's not extreme stuff to say. And I think with context now, a year and a half out of COVID, or out of the worst of it, you go, yeah, that's actually quite reasonable. If you don't, there may be a consequence if you don't take a vaccine, but you have the right to say, I don't want to take a vaccine. There may be a consequence if you protest and if you break the law, which no one should do, but you have the right in this country to protest. But when Poilievre was saying this stuff at the time, he was being presented in the media, in some cases, as this Trumpian, right-wing, white supremacist, wingnut person. And I remember thinking at the time, well, hang on a second. First of all, he's none of those things. Secondly, what he's saying is not unreasonable. And third, we have the right to protest in this country. So he was presented as this extreme figure by some, especially in the CBC and some in other media. It's certainly come out since he's none of those things. He's a conservative. He's more conservative than He's not like a red Tory. He's like a conservative. But so what?
He's a conservative,
Does that make
no
him an
question.
extremist? Of course not.
We're going to take a break and come back with some concluding comments from Dan Donovan. I'm going to ask him about the current polls that look pretty negative for our current Prime Minister. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. A real pleasure of mine to be chatting tonight with Dan Donovan, the editor and publisher of Ottawa Life magazine. Dan, that's www.ottawalife.ca. Is that correct?
.com. Life.com.
ottawalife.com. I recommend if you're interested in his articles, you should go to his website and check him out and support local media rather than just these big media behemoths that Dan has I think correctly criticized. We've talked about Bill C18. We've talked about Pierre Poilievre. We've talked about media in Canada today. Dan, the polls are pretty negative for Justin Trudeau. What do you think?
I think, it's interesting. I think two things are driving that. One is this government has had some serious capacity issues, Brian, and I think I have the sense right now that people in Canada are where people in Ontario were in 2018 with Kathleen Wynne. They're just sort of feeling like, shut up, go away, leave us alone, just go away.
Not bad, really.
I sense that. I just sense, and you see it. I'm originally from Atlantic Canada, originally from Nova Scotia, and the Liberal support in the Atlantic provinces has collapsed. The polling there shows that it's collapsing. It's driven by the carbon tax, which is fueling inflation. Part of the problem with the Trudeau government is they're ideologically driven. So Tom Mulcair wrote what I think is still the best political article in the last 2 years, a year ago, in June 2022, when he talked about a cross-government incompetency. And they're just not running things properly. They've got us into a massive debt. It's interesting to me, and we talked about this before, the Bank of Canada, between the Bank of Canada and their failure on interest rate policy, and Canada Mortgage and Housing, which has failed in terms of their job, in terms of housing and housing projections and so forth in this country. Do you know that those two federal agencies in the last 2.5 years have given their executives and staff $145 million in bonuses? So this government rewards agencies that are failing. The airports aren't working. There's a breakdown in healthcare in the country. We got the oligopolies in the banks. We've got high energy prices. We've got food. People just got to go into grocery stores and you have a heart attack. So I think there's this thing that's converging of the failed ideology. We have a government, unlike past Liberal governments, which were pragmatic, like Jean Chrétien, who was very popular, pragmatic, listening to people. We've got a government in place now that's extremely ideological, very left-wing, left of the NDP, and things aren't working. And I think people vote with their pocketbook, and everything is so expensive: housing, gas, food. And they're looking at this and they're saying, you know what, maybe we need to change. I think that's why today, as of today, the Conservatives are 11 points ahead in the polls in all areas of the country except for Quebec, where they're holding, I think, third in Quebec, and the Bloc Québécois first, and the Liberals are in the middle. So I think the Liberals need a change. The change they made in the cabinet shuffle is like shuffling chairs in the Titanic. I mean, I just couldn't believe they took the very failed immigration minister who's responsible for this immigration debacle we have in this country right now. And they said he's the guy that's apparently going to fix the housing crisis. And they made him the federal housing minister. The Trudeau government is fired. He fired Mendicino, obviously an incompetent justice minister, or sorry, a public safety minister. But then he fired David Lametti. He fired Bonaforte. I mean, they didn't. None of those ministers were strong. But Bonaforte then puts out a press release thanking him for her service and that she's going to run again. I mean, these people emasculate themselves in front of this prime minister, much like the former governor general did on the China interference thing. I don't understand why people, they don't walk in front of the bus for this Trudeau guy. They jump in front of the bus and get hit. So, but there's a disconnect somewhere because he's not popular. And I think that most governments are voted out. We don't vote governments in. So the Liberals are going to have to do some hard reflection here if they want to, if they want a chance at turning this around. And I don't know that it's going to be under Mr. Trudeau.
Dan Donovan, editor, publisher of Ottawa Life. Really appreciate you joining us tonight and giving us your point of view. I've run out of time, so I'm not going to be able to give you my counter argument and or my consistent argument, because on some things I completely agree with you and some other things I disagree with you. But I'll do that at another time. Bottom line, whether you're right or wrong, there's a message in the low popularity. There's a big, huge message in the low popularity. And the Trudeau government, the PMO, all those lobbyists that got Bill C18 passed, if you're right that they got that passed, and the media companies that are going to be losing a lot of traffic that are people that would have gone to their websites because they got the story initially on Facebook or Instagram or Google, are going to have to listen to what you said, because I think you're right in that people aren't going to be getting as much news. They're not going to be getting as much news from national media. They're going to be thinking about alternatives. They're going to be worried about inflation. They're going to be worried about high interest rates. They're going to be worried about high housing prices. They're going to be worried about the carbon tax. And they're going to be looking at the polls. And they're going to be listening to Pierre Poilievre as he travels across the country. And they're going to be thinking about the next election, and they're going to be wondering what they should do. So even if you're wrong that the government is incompetent, because I'm not sure it's actually incompetent, but even if you're wrong in that regard,
Tom Mulcair saying that. I'm just observing that his column, that he had a brilliant column where he laid that out, and I just thought it was very perceptive.
I think one of the problems is that you're right that it's very ideological. And it's extremely left wing, and I do think that one of the benefits of the Liberal parties in Ottawa and in Queen's Park previously has been that they've had left wing ideological people balanced in cabinet with some business oriented, not right wing but center people.
Yeah, agreed.
Dalton McGuinty, Charles Sousa, Bob Nixon. David Peterson, Dwight Duncan, provincially, and federally, John Turner, Paul Martin, Jean Chrétien, John Manley, etc. And I think that one of the challenges that the Liberal Party has today is they're all of one ideology, and you don't have that Bay Street oriented, business oriented, Main Street oriented, business oriented people in the cabinet that were the counterbalance that you had in the past. And I think that's a concern. But bottom line, with polls the way they are, and with C18 and interest rates and inflation and housing prices, you got to pay attention. Thank you, Dan. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Brian.
Good night, everybody.